The early 16th century was a time of turmoil and transformation. Two powerful empires, both seeking dominance over Europe and beyond, stood on the edge of conflict. On one side was the Ottoman Empire, ruled by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, a man whose military genius and ambition stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia. On the other side was the Holy Roman Empire, led by Charles V, a ruler whose lands extended across Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, and even the Americas. Their rivalry would shape the course of European and Mediterranean history for decades. Suleiman and Charles were born into greatness, but their paths to power were vastly different. Suleiman, the son of Sultan Selim I, inherited a disciplined and highly organized empire that had already conquered vast territories under his father's brutal campaigns. By the time he ascended the throne in 1520, the Ottomans were already the most formidable force in the Islamic world, and Suleiman had every intention of expanding further. His vision was clear: to bring all of Europe under Ottoman rule, a dream that had begun with his great-grandfather Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. Charles, on the other hand, was thrust into an empire that was as fractured as it was vast. Born in 1500 in the Habsburg family, he found himself heir to an array of crowns, including Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and the Holy Roman Empire. But his rule was never secure. His empire was a patchwork of different kingdoms, languages, and political interests, constantly under threat from internal revolts, Protestant reformations, and, of course, the ever-expanding Ottomans. Unlike Suleiman, who inherited a centralized and efficient system, Charles spent his entire reign fighting to hold his lands together. Their first direct clash came when Charles allied with Hungary and the Papal States to counter the Ottoman expansion. Suleiman, seeing Hungary as a crucial stepping stone into Central Europe, launched a massive campaign in 1521 to take Belgrade, the strongest Christian fortress in the Balkans. The Ottomans stormed the city, leaving little resistance for future invasions. This victory sent a shockwave through Christian Europe. Suleiman had proven that he was not just an ambitious ruler but a true military mastermind. By 1526, the Ottomans made their boldest move yet, the Battle of Mohacs. Hungary, already weakened and politically divided, was no match for Suleiman's highly trained forces. Within hours, the Hungarian army was decimated, and their young king, Louis II, drowned while fleeing. With Hungary now effectively an Ottoman vassal, the road to Vienna lay open. But it wasn't just a military conquest, it was a political message. Suleiman was challenging the authority of the Habsburgs, and Charles V knew he had to respond. While Suleiman was marching through Europe, Charles was engaged in battles of his own. His empire was under siege from multiple directions. Protestant reformers were breaking away from Catholic rule, France was a constant enemy, and his Spanish territories required constant attention. Despite these distractions, Charles knew that the Ottoman threat could not be ignored. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 would be the true test of their rivalry. As the Ottoman cannons roared outside the walls of Vienna, Charles's forces, though not physically present, played a crucial role. The defenders of Vienna, led by the Habsburgs, fought desperately to keep Suleiman's armies at bay. The battle was brutal, and for the first time, the Ottomans faced a real challenge in their European campaigns. Harsh weather and logistical issues forced Suleiman to retreat, marking the first significant setback in his expansionist ambitions. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 3 decades, Suleiman and Charles would engage in a relentless struggle, both directly and through their allies. Their battles were fought not only on land but also in the Mediterranean, where the Ottoman navy, led by legendary admirals like Barbarossa, clashed with the fleets of Spain and the Holy League. These naval conflicts would decide the fate of key territories, from North Africa to the Adriatic Sea. Yet, despite their rivalry, the two never met in battle personally. Instead, they fought through generals, commanders, and shifting alliances. Their struggle was not just a war of weapons but of ideologies: Islamic expansion versus Christian resistance, centralized Ottoman rule versus the fragmented European kingdoms, and the old medieval order versus the rising power of gunpowder empires. By the mid-16th century, both rulers faced their own struggles. Suleiman was aging, and his once mighty campaigns were slowing down. Charles, exhausted by constant warfare, abdicated his throne in 1556, retreating to a monastery in Spain. Their era of rivalry had come to an end, but the consequences of their battles would continue to shape Europe and the Middle East for centuries to come. As we move deeper into this story, we will uncover the most pivotal moments of this rivalry, the decisive battles, the naval wars, and the lasting legacies of both men. The next chapter takes us into the heart of their conflict, where armies clashed, empires trembled, and history was forever changed. The clash between Suleiman the Magnificent and Charles V was not just a conflict between two men. It was a war for dominance over Europe and the Mediterranean, a struggle between the might of the Ottoman Empire and the sprawling, fractured lands of the Holy Roman Empire. As their rivalry escalated, Europe became a battlefield where entire kingdoms were reshaped, alliances were forged and broken, and the fate of nations hung in the balance. The rise of two superpowers. By the early 16th century, the balance of power in Europe was shifting. The Ottomans had pushed deep into Hungary and the Balkans, leaving a trail of fallen Christian strongholds in their wake. The Holy Roman Empire, under Charles V, was vast but fragile, constantly threatened by internal uprisings, Protestant reformations, and the growing Ottoman menace. Charles knew that if Suleiman's armies were not stopped, Vienna would fall, and the Ottomans would have a direct path into the heart of Europe. Meanwhile, Suleiman saw the fragmented European states as an opportunity, one that he could exploit to bring more Christian lands under Ottoman control. Their first true test of power came in the form of an epic confrontation, the battle for control over Central Europe. The Battle of Mohacs, the fall of Hungary. In 1526, Suleiman made his most daring move yet, an all-out invasion of Hungary. Hungary was the last major Christian kingdom standing between the Ottomans and the Holy Roman Empire. If it fell, Vienna would be next. King Louis II of Hungary, a young and inexperienced ruler, knew that war was inevitable. He called upon his allies, but help was scarce. Charles V was tied up in wars against France, and the Pope's support was limited. Left to defend his kingdom alone, Louis gathered what forces he could and marched to meet the Ottomans at Mohacs. When the two armies finally clashed on August 29, 1526, it was a massacre. The Hungarian forces were outnumbered, poorly equipped, and unprepared for the brutal efficiency of the Ottoman military. Within 2 hours, the Hungarian army was completely annihilated. King Louis himself drowned in a river while trying to escape, and with his death, the Hungarian kingdom collapsed. Suleiman's victory at Mohacs sent shockwaves through Europe. Hungary was no longer an independent kingdom. It was now divided, with the Ottomans controlling most of the territory, while the Habsburgs, under Charles V's brother Ferdinand, desperately tried to hold on to Western Hungary and Austria. But for Suleiman, Mohacs was not the end, it was just the beginning. Vienna was now within reach, and the Sultan was determined to take it. The Siege of Vienna. The Ottoman advance stalls. In 1529, Suleiman led one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen, more than 100,000 soldiers, toward the gates of Vienna, the capital of the Habsburgs. If he could take the city, it would deal a crippling blow to Charles V's rule in Europe. Vienna, however, was prepared. The city's garrison, led by Nicholas Graf Salm, was vastly outnumbered, but they had one key advantage: the walls of Vienna were strong and heavily fortified. The Ottomans launched relentless attacks, using cannons, sappers, and elite janissaries, but Vienna refused to fall. For weeks, the city held out. Then, as winter approached, the tides turned. The Ottoman supply lines were stretched too thin, and the brutal cold and rain made it impossible to continue the siege. On October 14, 1529, Suleiman ordered a retreat. The failure to take Vienna was the first major setback in Suleiman's European campaign. It showed that while the Ottomans were powerful, they were not invincible. For Charles V, this was a rare moment of relief, but he knew the war was far from over. The fight for Hungary. A war that never ends. With Vienna secure, for now, the battle shifted to Hungary, where both sides fought a brutal war for control. Suleiman installed John Zapolya as his puppet king, while Charles V's brother Ferdinand tried to claim the throne for the Habsburgs. This created a three-way war: Ottomans, Habsburgs, and Hungarian nobles, all vying for power. For decades, Hungary remained a bloody battleground. Every time the Habsburgs made gains, Suleiman would march back and reclaim lost territory. Neither side could fully secure the kingdom, turning Hungary into a buffer zone between the Christian West and the Muslim East. But while Charles fought on land, another front was opening at sea: a battle for control of the Mediterranean. Naval warfare. The battle for the Mediterranean. While Suleiman and Charles clashed on the battlefields of Europe, their fleets were waging an equally vicious war in the Mediterranean. The Ottomans had one of the most powerful navies in the world, led by legendary admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa, who terrorized Christian ports, raided Spanish ships, and took entire coastal towns. Charles, recognizing the Ottoman naval threat, formed the Holy League, an alliance of Christian powers that sought to challenge Ottoman dominance at sea. One of the most dramatic encounters came in 1538 at the Battle of Preveza, where Barbarossa crushed the Christian fleet, cementing Ottoman naval supremacy. For Charles, this was a huge loss. The Ottomans now controlled most of the Mediterranean, making it easier for them to launch attacks on southern Europe and North Africa. The battle for supremacy was no longer just about land, it was about controlling the seas as well. The turning point. The Long War begins. By the 1540s, it was clear that neither Suleiman nor Charles could eliminate the other completely. Europe had become a continent divided, with the Ottomans controlling the Balkans and the eastern Mediterranean, while the Habsburgs and their allies held on to Central and Western Europe. But Charles was exhausted. He had spent his entire reign fighting wars on multiple fronts, against France, the Protestants, and the Ottomans. The cost of endless war had drained the Holy Roman Empire's resources. By 1556, Charles V abdicated the throne, breaking his empire into two parts. His son Philip II took control of Spain and its territories, while his brother Ferdinand took the Austrian and German lands. Suleiman, on the other hand, continued his reign, leading his empire until his death in 1566. The legacy of their battles. The rivalry between Suleiman and Charles was one of the greatest power struggles in history. It shaped the borders of Europe and the Middle East, leaving lasting consequences. Hungary remained divided for over 150 years between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. The Ottoman navy dominated the Mediterranean for decades. The Holy Roman Empire weakened, paving the way for the rise of nation-states like Spain and Austria. The Ottoman advance into Europe slowed, but the empire remained a dominant force. Though neither Charles nor Suleiman truly won, their wars reshaped Europe forever. Their legacies continued through successors who carried on the battles, but the rivalry between East and West, Christianity and Islam, persisted for centuries to come. And this was just one chapter. The next phase of their struggle would take place on the seas, where admirals and pirates fought for control of the Mediterranean, a war that would push the limits of both empires. The wars between Suleiman the Magnificent and Charles V were not confined to the fields of Europe. Their conflict extended to the Mediterranean Sea, where control over trade routes, islands, and coastal strongholds became just as important as the battles on land. This was not just a war between two rulers, it was a war of pirates, admirals, and empires. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been a highway of commerce, connecting Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. But with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, it was turning into something else, a battleground where ships burned, coastal cities fell, and legendary warriors carved their names into history. The rise of Barbarossa, the Sultan's greatest admiral. As Suleiman expanded his empire, he knew that control over the seas would be just as important as his conquests on land. His rival, Charles V, ruled vast territories, including Spain, the Netherlands, and parts of Italy. If Charles dominated the Mediterranean, the Ottomans would be cut off from vital trade routes and vulnerable to attacks on their coastal cities. To counter this threat, Suleiman turned to an unlikely ally, a corsair who had already made a name for himself raiding Christian ships and towns. His name was Hayreddin Barbarossa, a man who would soon become the most feared admiral in the Mediterranean. Barbarossa and his brother had started as pirates, attacking Spanish and Venetian ships, capturing slaves, and establishing their power along the North African coast. But they were no ordinary pirates. Their fleet was growing, and they had no allegiance to any European power. When Suleiman saw their potential, he offered Barbarossa a position as the Ottoman Grand Admiral. With this alliance, the balance of power at sea shifted overnight. The Ottomans were no longer just a land empire, they now had a fleet that could challenge the might of Spain, Venice, and the Papal States. Charles V strikes first. The battle for Tunis. Charles V understood the threat that Barbarossa posed. If left unchecked, the Ottomans could control the entire North African coast, turning it into a base for attacks on Italy and Spain. So in 1535, Charles gathered one of the largest invasion fleets ever assembled, a force of over 400 ships and 30,000 soldiers, including some of the best warriors in Europe. His target, Tunis, the most important Ottoman stronghold in North Africa. When Charles's armada arrived, the city of Tunis was caught off guard. Barbarossa had built strong defenses, but the Christian forces were too overwhelming. After a brutal battle, Tunis fell, and Charles claimed victory. The defeat was a major setback for the Ottomans, but Barbarossa was far from finished. The Battle of Preveza, the Ottoman counterattack. Losing Tunis was a blow, but Suleiman and Barbarossa were determined to reclaim Ottoman dominance at sea. They rebuilt their fleet, expanded their power, and prepared for a decisive battle. In 1538, the moment arrived. A massive Christian alliance, known as the Holy League, was formed under Pope Paul III to stop the Ottoman advance. The League brought together Venetian, Spanish, and Papal fleets, led by Genoese Admiral Andrea Doria, one of Charles V's best commanders. Doria and his fleet set sail for Preveza, a strategic Ottoman-held port in Greece. But waiting for them was Barbarossa, who had carefully positioned his fleet for battle. Unlike the European forces, which were a loose coalition with different tactics, Barbarossa's fleet was unified, disciplined, and perfectly coordinated. When the battle began, it was clear who had the advantage. Barbarossa used the wind and shallow waters to trap the Christian fleet, launching devastating attacks while avoiding damage himself. Within hours, Doria's forces were in disarray, and the Holy League was forced to retreat. The Battle of Preveza was a turning point. The Ottoman navy crushed the Christian fleet, securing dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. While Charles V still controlled Spain and parts of Italy, he had lost the ability to challenge Ottoman power at sea. The Pirate Wars, attacks on the Christian coastline. With the Ottomans now in control, the Mediterranean became a nightmare for European merchants and sailors. Barbarossa and his fleet launched raids across the coast, attacking towns in Spain, Italy, and even France. In 1543, Barbarossa captured Nice in France, delivering it as a gift to Suleiman. He even used Ottoman ships to aid the French against the Habsburgs, showing just how deeply the European powers were divided. The Spanish, desperate to defend their coastlines, built a vast network of watchtowers and fortresses. But it was never enough. The Ottoman fleet, along with their North African allies, raided at will, capturing ships, looting towns, and taking thousands of slaves. The final showdown, the Battle of Jerba. By the 1560s, Charles V had abdicated, and his son Philip II had taken control of Spain. The war for the Mediterranean was not over, and both sides continued their fight for dominance. In 1560, a massive Christian fleet, determined to avenge past defeats, launched an attack on the Ottoman-held island of Jerba, a key stronghold off the coast of North Africa. The Spaniards, Venetians, and Papal forces believed they could finally turn the tide. But the Ottomans, now under the command of Peel Pasha, responded with a lightning-fast counterattack. Within hours, the Christian fleet was devastated, and thousands of soldiers were either killed or captured. The Battle of Jerba was one of the worst naval defeats for the Europeans. It reaffirmed Ottoman naval supremacy, and for decades after, the Mediterranean remained under their control. Who won the war for the Mediterranean? Though the Ottomans dominated most of the Mediterranean, Charles V's empire was not completely defeated. Spain still controlled parts of Italy, and while their fleets were weakened, they continued to fight. But the reality was clear. Suleiman and his navy had reshaped the balance of power at sea. The Ottoman fleet had secured dominance over the eastern Mediterranean, raided the coasts of Europe with near impunity, turned North Africa into an Ottoman stronghold. For Charles V and his successors, the loss of naval power was a crippling blow. Spain would later rebuild its navy, but by then, the Mediterranean was no longer the Habsburgs' battleground. The real conflict had shifted elsewhere. The legacy of naval supremacy. The war for the Mediterranean lasted decades, and while the Ottomans ultimately controlled the sea, the battles weakened both empires. For the Ottomans, the victories came at a cost. Constant warfare drained resources, and new threats were rising in the east. For Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, the loss of naval power meant they had to shift their focus elsewhere, leading to new wars in the Atlantic and the Americas. In the end, Suleiman and Charles V's naval war changed the world. It reshaped trade routes, military tactics, and the future of Europe's coastal defenses. But the rivalry wasn't over yet. As both leaders approached the final years of their rule, a new battlefield emerged, one that would decide not just who ruled the seas, but who would define the future of Europe itself. The year was 1529, and Europe was on edge. In the east, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent had become the most powerful force in the world. In the west, Charles V and the Habsburgs ruled over a vast empire stretching from Spain to Austria. Their rivalry had already shaken the Mediterranean and the battlefields of Hungary. But now, the war was moving to a new front, one that would determine the future of Christian Europe. The Ottomans were not just expanding, they were marching toward the heart of Europe. Their target, Vienna, the stronghold of the Habsburgs, the gateway between East and West. This was not just another military campaign. It was a battle of civilizations, religions, and empires. If Vienna fell, there would be little to stop the Ottoman advance into Germany and beyond. But if the city held, it could mark the beginning of the end for Ottoman expansion in Europe. The road to Vienna. Why did Suleiman attack? Suleiman had already crushed Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. King Louis II of Hungary had been killed, and much of his kingdom had fallen under Ottoman rule. But Austria, under the leadership of Ferdinand I, the brother of Charles V, refused to submit. Vienna was the last major stronghold standing in the way of total Ottoman dominance in Central Europe. For Suleiman, Vienna was more than a military target, it was a symbol of Habsburg resistance. If he could take the city, he would send a clear message to Europe: the Ottomans were unstoppable. So in the spring of 1529, Suleiman assembled one of the largest armies ever seen. Over 100,000 soldiers, cavalry, and artillerymen marched toward Vienna, accompanied by a massive siege train. The Sultan was determined to make this city his greatest conquest. The defenders. A city prepares for war. Vienna, however, was not an easy target. The city was protected by high walls, deep moats, and a determined garrison. Ferdinand I knew he could not match the Ottoman army in numbers, so he prepared for a defensive stand. Inside the city were barely 20,000 defenders, a mix of Austrian troops, German mercenaries, and local militias. But they had a secret weapon: Nicholas Graf Salm, a veteran commander who had fought against the Ottomans before. Salm knew that direct battle against the Ottomans was suicidal. Instead, he focused on strengthening Vienna's fortifications, stockpiling food, and preparing for a brutal siege. If the defenders could hold long enough, winter would come, and the Ottomans would be forced to retreat. The siege begins. Ottoman artillery shakes the walls. By late September 1529, the Ottoman army arrived at the gates of Vienna. Their massive cannons were positioned, and within days, the bombardment began. The city's walls shook under the relentless fire, and Ottoman engineers began digging tunnels underneath, trying to plant explosives and collapse the defenses. Suleiman had full confidence in victory. He had never lost a major battle, and his forces were the best trained soldiers in the world. The Janissaries, his elite troops, were eager to storm the city. But Vienna refused to fall. Each time the Ottomans tried to breach the walls, they were met with fierce resistance. A desperate struggle. The battle for the city. For weeks, the battle raged. The Ottomans launched wave after wave of attacks, sending ladders up the walls, trying to break through the gates. But the defenders fought back with everything they had: arrows, boiling oil, even hand-to-hand combat. As the siege dragged on, Suleiman faced an unexpected enemy: time. The rains began, turning the battlefield into a muddy swamp. Supplies were running low, and the Ottomans were not prepared for a long siege. Disease spread through the camp, and morale began to crumble. Suleiman ordered one final, all-out assault on Vienna's walls. The Janissaries stormed forward, breaking through sections of the outer defenses. For a moment, it seemed like the city was about to fall. But then, disaster struck for the Ottomans. A sudden counterattack by the defenders, led by Nicholas Graf Salm, pushed the Ottomans back. The Janissaries retreated in confusion, and for the first time, Suleiman realized he would not take Vienna. The Ottoman retreat. A crushing blow. By mid-October, the Ottoman army was exhausted. The siege had failed, and winter was approaching. Suleiman reluctantly ordered a retreat, leaving behind thousands of dead soldiers and abandoned artillery. The retreat was chaotic. Heavy rains had turned the roads into rivers of mud, and many Ottoman soldiers died from starvation and disease. The once invincible Ottoman army limped back to Istanbul, humiliated. Why was Vienna the turning point? The Siege of Vienna was the first major defeat of Suleiman's career. Until this point, the Ottomans had been unstoppable in Europe. But now, they had met a fortress they could not conquer. More importantly, it proved that Europe could resist the Ottoman advance. Had Vienna fallen, the Ottomans might have marched deeper into Germany, threatening the very heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Instead, the defeat at Vienna marked the high point of Ottoman expansion in the West. Though the Ottomans would continue to be a dominant force, they would never again threaten Central Europe in the same way. For Charles V and Ferdinand I, Vienna was not just a victory, it was a symbol of survival. The Christian world had stood its ground, and the tide of war had begun to shift. The legacy of the Siege of Vienna. The siege left a lasting impact on European history. It forced the Habsburgs to strengthen their defenses and prepare for future wars. It also exposed the weaknesses in the Ottoman war machine. They could win battles, but they struggled with long sieges and supply lines. For Suleiman, it was a bitter lesson. Though he remained a powerful ruler, the failure at Vienna showed that even the most powerful empires had limits. But the war between Suleiman and Charles V was far from over. The next phase of their rivalry would take place on a different battlefield, one that would decide the true victor of this age-old struggle. A clash of titans, the aftermath of a war that shaped the world. As the dust settled on the battlefields of Vienna, the Mediterranean, and Eastern Europe, one question lingered: who truly won? Was it Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan whose empire stretched across 3 continents, or Charles V, the Habsburg emperor who ruled lands so vast that the sun never set on his dominion? To understand their legacies, we must look beyond the victories and defeats on the battlefield. The true measure of a ruler lies in the world they leave behind, the empires they shape, and the history they define. Suleiman's empire. The zenith of Ottoman power. Suleiman ascended the throne in 1520, inheriting a powerful but fragmented empire. By the time of his death in 1566, he had transformed the Ottoman state into the most formidable force in the world. Under his rule, the Ottomans expanded their territory from Hungary in the north to the Arabian Peninsula in the south, and from Persia in the east to North Africa in the west. Controlled key trade routes, dominating commerce between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Developed a sophisticated legal and administrative system, earning him the title Kanuni, the lawgiver. But conquest was not the only pillar of Suleiman's rule. He was a patron of the arts, architecture, and literature, commissioning the great Suleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul and sponsoring some of the finest scholars of the Islamic world. His navy, led by Barbarossa, ruled the Mediterranean, striking fear into European powers. His military reforms ensured that the Janissaries remained the most elite fighting force in the world. Yet, for all his success, Suleiman's later years were marked by tragedy. His beloved wife Hürrem Sultan passed away, his most capable son Mustafa was executed, and his chosen heir Selim II was a far weaker ruler. The cracks in the empire's foundation had begun to show, though they would not fully emerge until after his death. Charles V. A struggle to hold an empire together. If Suleiman's reign was marked by expansion, Charles V's was defined by endless struggle. His vast empire, stretching from Spain and the Netherlands to Austria and the Americas, was a political nightmare to govern. Unlike Suleiman, who ruled a unified Islamic empire, Charles faced constant division. His lands were divided by language, culture, and religion. The Protestant Reformation split the Holy Roman Empire, forcing him into religious wars against his own subjects. His Spanish colonies in the New World required constant oversight. The Ottomans threatened his eastern borders, while France remained his bitter enemy in the west. Despite these challenges, Charles V achieved remarkable victories. He crushed the Schmalkaldic League, a coalition of Protestant princes, and secured Catholic dominance in much of Europe. His generals, such as Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, won key battles that preserved Habsburg power. But unlike Suleiman, Charles was never able to truly consolidate his empire. The constant wars drained his resources, and by 1556, exhausted and disillusioned, he abdicated the throne, dividing his empire between his son Philip II of Spain and his brother Ferdinand I, who became Holy Roman Emperor. His dream of a unified Christendom under Habsburg rule had failed. Europe was now deeply divided, and the Ottoman threat still loomed large. The verdict: who truly won? If we look at military victories, Suleiman had the upper hand. He won decisive battles at Mohacs, Rhodes, and Preveza, expanding Ottoman dominance. Charles, though victorious in some European conflicts, struggled to counter the Ottomans in the long term. If we judge by lasting influence, both left indelible marks on history. Suleiman cemented Ottoman supremacy for the next century, while Charles V's lineage would continue to shape Europe through the Habsburg dynasty. If we consider stability, Suleiman's empire remained strong after his death, while Charles's crumbled almost immediately. The Spanish crown fell into financial crises, and the Holy Roman Empire fractured into religious wars that would rage for decades. But victory is not always measured in immediate outcomes. While Suleiman's empire reached its peak under his rule, the Ottomans would decline in the centuries to come. Charles V's empire, though weakened, set the stage for Spanish and Austrian dominance in the next era. The legacy of two great rivals, Suleiman and Charles V, were more than just adversaries on the battlefield. They were visionaries, reformers, and architects of their civilizations. Suleiman left behind an empire of laws, culture, and military prowess, shaping the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans for centuries. Charles left behind a dynastic legacy. The Habsburgs would continue to rule Spain and Austria, influencing European politics for generations. Both rulers shaped the destiny of Europe and the Islamic world, defining an era of empire building, religious strife, and global conflict. Neither truly won, in the traditional sense. Instead, they became immortal figures in history, remembered not for a single victory or loss, but for how they shaped the world we know today. The end of an era, the birth of a new world. The clash between Suleiman the Magnificent and Charles V was more than just a rivalry between two rulers. It was a battle of civilizations, ideologies, and the very future of Europe and the Islamic world. For decades, their empires waged war on land and sea, shaping the course of history in ways neither could have fully foreseen. By the time both men had left the world stage, the map of Europe and the Mediterranean had been redrawn, power had shifted, and new conflicts were already brewing. But their struggle was not just about territory or military dominance. It was about what kind of world would emerge from the ashes of their wars. The war that never truly ended. Though Charles V and Suleiman never met in person, their forces clashed in Hungary, Vienna, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. The wars between their empires defined the balance of power in 16th-century Europe and the Middle East. But did these wars have a true victor? After Charles's abdication, the Holy Roman Empire fractured into religious wars that lasted for decades. Spain, though still a superpower under Philip II, struggled with financial crises and overextension. The Ottoman Empire, despite reaching its peak under Suleiman, began to show the first signs of stagnation, as internal struggles and weak successors followed. Yet, the Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry would not die with them. Their successors would continue the struggle for control of the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and Central Europe for another 150 years. The conflicts that Suleiman and Charles had started continued long after they were gone, shaping the world for centuries. The Ottoman Empire after Suleiman. Suleiman left behind an empire at its zenith, militarily, politically, and economically. His legal and administrative reforms ensured stability for the next century. His successors, however, lacked his strength. The Ottoman military machine remained powerful, but its expansion slowed. After the death of his successor, Selim II, the empire became more reliant on advisors and bureaucrats, leading to internal power struggles. The strength of the Janissaries began to decline, and the empire would eventually lose its technological and military edge against Europe. However, for nearly a century after Suleiman's death, the Ottomans remained a dominant force. They continued to threaten Vienna, fought back against European coalitions, and remained the greatest power in the Islamic world. The Habsburgs after Charles V. When Charles V divided his empire between his son Philip II and his brother Ferdinand I, he ensured that the Habsburgs would remain powerful. But his dream of a unified Christendom under Habsburg rule had failed. The Holy Roman Empire fractured into religious conflicts, leading to the devastating 30 Years' War, 1618–1648. Spain, though a dominant force under Philip II, faced endless wars against the Dutch, the English, and the Ottomans. Yet, the Habsburgs remained influential in European politics for centuries. They ruled Austria, Spain, and large parts of Central Europe, shaping the future of the continent in ways that Charles himself could never have imagined. A legacy written in blood and stone. The rivalry between Suleiman and Charles was not just about conquest, it was about shaping the world. The wars they fought altered history, influencing everything from religion and empire building to diplomacy and trade. Suleiman's legacy lived on in the laws, architecture, and military power of the Ottoman Empire. Charles's legacy endured through the Habsburg dynasty, the Catholic-Protestant divide, and the Spanish Empire's global reach. Even today, the echoes of their struggle can be seen in the modern world. The borders of Europe and the Middle East, the religious divisions, and the balance of power that followed all trace back to this monumental rivalry. There was no single victor in this battle. Instead, there were two giants who left their mark on history, two men who shaped the destiny of empires and changed the world forever.